Dawn broke over Mesa Valley, Arizona. Maria Ramirez, aged 95, watched through her screen door as 3 cartel members trampled her roses. Their leader thought threatening a helpless old widow would be easy. He didn't know he'd just targeted the wrong grandmother. Behind her weathered hands and silver hair, Maria had spent 40 years as the CIA's top communications expert in South America. Her trembling fingers weren't dialing 911. They were entering a code that hadn't been used since the Cold War. As dust rose from approaching cartel vehicles, 12 heavily armed figures were already moving through her orange groves. This wasn't about scaring an elderly farmer. This was about how the most notorious cartel in Mexico had just stumbled into a trap set by the woman who had orchestrated their leader's father's downfall in 1973. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because I have something really special for you tomorrow. And now, back to the video. The warning signs had started 3 months earlier. Maria had noticed subtle changes in local traffic patterns, unfamiliar vehicles taking too much interest in her property boundaries, satellite dishes on neighboring farms suddenly repositioned. To most, these would seem like innocent coincidences. But Maria hadn't survived 4 decades in intelligence by believing in coincidences. She'd first activated her old network 2 weeks ago, when her sensors detected unauthorized drone flights over the orange groves. The drones were good, military grade, with sophisticated stealth features. But they weren't good enough to evade detection systems that had been quietly upgraded over 30 years of retirement. "They're getting bolder," Jorge had said during their weekly encrypted video call. Her old teammate, now a grandfather of 5, still maintained his contacts in 3 different intelligence agencies. The cartels are pushing north, looking for new distribution routes. Maria had listened, adding the information to her mental database while she pruned her roses. Each flower bed contained sensor arrays disguised as irrigation equipment. The roses themselves were carefully chosen varieties, each one requiring specific maintenance that gave her legitimate reasons to be in different parts of her property at regular times. Perfect coverage, hidden in plain sight. Elena's psychological profile of the cartel's new leadership had arrived yesterday. Miguel Ortiz Jr. is nothing like his father, the report concluded. Where Senior was calculating, Junior is impulsive. He's trying to prove himself by aggressive expansion. Maria had added this to her growing file, noting how it matched the pattern of recent cartel activities across the Southwest. Now, watching the cartel members through her security feeds, Maria saw Elena's analysis playing out in real time. Their approach was sloppy, confident. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman. She counted 3 visible vehicles, probably more hidden in the desert scrub beyond her property line. Their radio communications were encrypted, but with amateur-level security that her systems had cracked within seconds. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maria's kitchen as she calmly poured herself a cup of coffee. Through the window, she could see the cartel members growing increasingly agitated, their black SUVs kicking up dust clouds in her driveway. Her arthritic hands might shake while holding her porcelain cup, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She thought back to that fateful operation in '73, when she'd helped dismantle the Ortiz cartel's communication network. Now, decades later, Miguel Ortiz Jr. was making the same mistakes as his father, underestimating the quiet ones. The memories of that operation flooded back as she watched the cartel members through her security feeds. It had been a different time then, when technology meant encrypted radio signals and dead drops rather than smartphones and satellite feeds. She'd been younger, of course, but already known for her ability to crack even the most sophisticated communication networks. The Ortiz cartel had been at the height of its power, running operations across 3 continents. Their downfall had started with a single intercepted message, decoded by Maria in a cramped safe house in Mexico City. The safe house in Mexico City had been small, barely large enough for her radio equipment and a cot. Maria remembered the heat, the constant drone of traffic outside, and most importantly, the moment she first cracked the Ortiz cartel's communication code. It had taken her 3 weeks of patient listening, cataloging patterns, and analyzing frequencies. The cartel had thought their system unbreakable, a hybrid of naval codes and indigenous languages that had stumped every other intelligence agency. But Maria had seen something they'd missed. Growing up in a small village in southern Arizona, she'd learned her grandmother's native Yaqui language. The cartel's code used a modified version, thinking no one would recognize the underlying patterns. Their mistake had cost them everything. Now, 47 years later, Maria moved through her kitchen with practiced efficiency, checking feeds from cameras hidden throughout her property. The modern security system interfaced seamlessly with Cold War-era equipment that she'd maintained and upgraded over the decades. Some habits never died, like keeping backup communications in analog, immune to digital interference. Carlos, her old partner from those days, had warned her 6 months ago that Miguel Jr. was expanding his territory. "He's not as careful as his father," Carlos had said during one of their weekly chess games. "But he's twice as ambitious." Maria had listened, adding the information to her mental database of cartel movements. She'd chosen this property 20 years ago for its strategic value. High ground, clear sightlines, and most importantly, a network of underground tunnels dating back to the Prohibition era. The same tunnels that had once served bootleggers now housed her surveillance equipment and escape routes. The lead cartel member, a man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, pounded on her door. "Senora Ramirez," he shouted, "you have 1 hour to sign over your land." Maria smiled, remembering a similar threat in Bogotá, 1975. She checked her watch, 7 minutes until her old team would be in position. The cartel had chosen her land for its strategic location, perfect for their smuggling operations. They didn't know she'd chosen it for the same reason 40 years ago. Static crackled from a hidden speaker in her kitchen cabinet. A familiar voice, aged but steady. "Mockingbird, this is Condor, package secured, green light in 5. Maria hadn't heard that code name in years, but muscle memory took over. She reached under her sink, removing a false panel to reveal a sophisticated communications array. The equipment might be dated, but the network was still active. She'd maintained it all these years, knowing this day might come. Under the orange, Groves, in a bunker that officially didn't exist, her old team was assembling. They'd been arriving quietly over the past week, drawn by coded messages that only they would understand. Jorge, former Special Forces, now a grandfather of 5, checking his tactical gear with practiced precision. Elena, once the CIA's top psychological profiler, reviewing satellite imagery of cartel movements. And Thomas, who'd retired as the agency's chief of South American operations, coordinating with current federal authorities who owed their careers to his mentorship. The underground command center beneath Maria's orange grove was a testament to 4 decades of careful planning. What had started as a Prohibition-era bootleggers tunnel system had been transformed into a state-of-the-art intelligence hub, upgraded piece by piece over 30 years of quiet retirement. "Systems check complete," announced Sarah Chen, Jorge's granddaughter and the team's cyber warfare specialist. Her workstation dominated one wall of the bunker, multiple screens displaying real-time data from sensors throughout the property. "Quantum encryption is holding and our honeypot networks are already attracting attention. Someone's trying very hard to map our communications." Maria watched the younger woman work, remembering how Jorge had first introduced them 5 years ago. "My granddaughter needs a summer job," he'd said with a knowing smile. "Something to keep her busy between semesters at MIT. That summer had turned into a complete overhaul of the farm's digital defenses, as Sarah discovered the elegant complexity of Maria's old systems and helped modernize them without losing their core unpredictability. "They're probing the north quadrant now," Thomas reported from his station. His silver hair might have thinned, but his eyes were sharp as ever behind tactical glasses that fed him constant updates. 3 teams, moving in standard cartel formation. "No, wait." He leaned closer to his screen. "This is different. The rear team is maintaining professional spacing, military training." Eleanor nodded, updating her psychological profile in real time. "Miguel Jr. is mixing his regular cartel muscle with professional operators. Interesting. He's learning from his previous failures, but not fast enough." Her workspace was a blend of old and new, handwritten notes and personality assessments, alongside AI-driven behavior prediction models. In the corner, Jorge was running his team through final equipment checks. The youngest of them was 58, the oldest 73, but they moved with the fluid precision that came from decades of experience. Their gear was an eclectic mix of vintage and cutting-edge, tried-and-true weapons alongside modern communications and surveillance equipment. "Reminds me of Bogotá," Maria said, studying the tactical display. Remember how your father tried to use ex-KGB operators to protect his shipping lanes? She directed this to Miguel Jr. through the cameras, though he couldn't hear her. He thought having trained professionals would make up for strategic weakness. It didn't work then either. The cartel's initial probe was textbook cartel tactics: intimidation through show of force. 3 black SUVs prominently displayed, while the real assault teams moved hidden through the desert brush. Maria's thermal cameras picked up 12. More figures approaching from multiple angles, their movement patterns confirming Thomas's assessment of military training. They're good, Sarah admitted, tracking the hidden teams through her systems, using latest-gen thermal blankets, signal, discipline, even some electronic countermeasures. Almost good enough. Maria smiled at the almost. The farm's defensive systems had been built in layers over decades, each new technology integrated with older methods that modern operators often overlooked. The thermal cameras picking up the assault teams weren't just relying on heat signatures. They were part of a multispectral analysis system that had originally been developed for tracking Soviet agents through mountain passes. Signal intercept, Elena announced. They're using a rotating frequency encryption. Want me to crack it? No need, Maria replied, moving to her own station. Watch this. Her fingers, though gnarled with arthritis, moved surely over her keyboard. On the main screen, lines of code appeared. The original algorithm she'd developed to crack the Ortiz cartel's communications in 1973. Miguel Jr. is using an upgraded version of his father's old code, probably thinks he's honoring tradition. The algorithm worked through the encryption in seconds. Clear audio filled the command center. Primary teams in position, waiting for visual confirmation of the old woman's location before we move. On the house. Should we let them know we're listening? Sarah asked, a mischievous glint in her eye. Maria considered it. In the old days, she would have maintained the element of surprise. But she wasn't just running an operation now. She was teaching a new generation. Do it, she decided. Something subtle. Let's see how they react. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard. Moments later, the cartel's radio channels played 3 seconds of an old Mexican folk song, the same one that had been playing when Maria's team had arrested Miguel Sr. in 1973. The effect was immediate. The hidden teams froze in place. The radio channels erupted with urgent chatter, now in multiple encryption protocols as they tried to secure their communications. Maria watched the thermal signatures of the team leaders gesturing urgently, their professional composure cracked by the realization that their simple intimidation operation had just become something far more complex. They're calling for backup, Thomas reported, monitoring longer-range communications. Lots of backup, multiple vehicles moving from staging areas across the border. He paused, studying new data. Wait, some of these communication protocols, they're not cartel standard, not military either. Maria felt a familiar tension in her chest, the one that had always signaled when an operation was about to evolve beyond its initial parameters. She studied the new communication signatures herself, recognizing patterns she hadn't seen in decades. No, she said quietly. Those aren't cartel protocols. Those are intelligence service codes. Someone in Miguel Jr.'s organization has connections we didn't know about. Elena was already updating her analysis. This fits. The professional operators, the sophisticated equipment, the multi-layered approach. Miguel Jr. isn't just trying to expand his territory. He's trying to transform his cartel into something else. Something more like what his uncle Eduardo always wanted, Maria finished. She hadn't thought about Eduardo Ortiz in years. While Miguel Sr. had been content to run drugs, his younger brother had always dreamed bigger. In 1973, they'd found evidence that Eduardo had been building something more ambitious, a private intelligence network that could rival government agencies. They'd thought that part of the operation had died with Miguel Sr.'s arrest. Sarah, Maria commanded, get me everything you can on Eduardo Ortiz's activities for the past 40 years. Elena, revise your threat assessment. Thomas, contact your friends in the agency. We need to know who Eduardo's been talking to. She turned to Jorge. And get your team ready. This isn't just about protecting my farm anymore. This is about finishing what we started in 1973. As her team moved with renewed purpose, Maria walked to the bunker's small kitchen. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared a fresh pot of coffee, the special blend she'd always made during critical operations. Outside, Miguel Jr.'s teams were regrouping, probably waiting for new orders from whoever was really running this operation. They thought they had time to adapt, to bring in their secret weapons and hidden resources. Maria smiled as she poured the coffee. Let them think that. Let them call in every asset and advantage they had. After all, she'd spent 40 years preparing this farm for exactly this moment. Every tree, every rosebush, every seemingly innocent piece of agricultural equipment was part of an elaborate trap. And now, finally, all the players were walking right into it. The first explosion illuminated the pre-dawn sky, a brilliant flash followed by a deep rumble that shook the orange trees. Maria watched through her thermal feeds as the cartel's forward team scattered for cover. They'd triggered one of Jorge's old-school tripwires, not meant to kill, just to announce that the real game had begun. 3 vehicles approaching from the south, Sarah reported, her fingers dancing across multiple keyboards. Different signature than the others. Better, more electronic shielding, military-grade communications. She paused, eyes widening at new data streaming across her screens. They're using quantum encrypted channels. These aren't cartel assets. Maria nodded, unsurprised. The quantum encryption confirmed her suspicions about Eduardo's involvement. Her brother-in-law had always been the true visionary in the family, seeing beyond mere drug trafficking to something far more ambitious. While Miguel Sr. had built a cartel, Eduardo had dreamed of building an empire. "Show me the approach vector," she commanded, the main screen filled with satellite imagery, overlaid with thermal and electromagnetic signatures. The new vehicles were taking a careful route, avoiding the obvious approaches to the farm. Their movement pattern was familiar. Maria had helped develop it during a joint CIA-NSA operation in the 80s. Elena's voice cut through the tactical chatter. "We're getting hits on facial recognition. You need to see this, Maria." The psychological profiler's usual calm showed a crack of genuine concern. The third vehicle, it's him. Eduardo himself is on site. The command center fell silent. Eduardo Ortiz hadn't been seen in public since the failed coup attempt in Venezuela in '89. The fact that he'd emerged now for this operation changed everything. Maria felt old memories stirring. The taste of coffee in a Bogota safe house. The smell of gunpowder in a Mexico City alley. The sound of Eduardo's laugh during their last conversation before she'd helped dismantle his brother's empire. "Sarah, show me the farm's outer defensive grid," Maria ordered. Her voice steady despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. The main screen shifted, displaying a complex network of sensors, cameras, and more exotic security measures laid down over decades. Highlight the subsystems we installed during the Mitchell administration. A section of the grid lit up in red. Older technology, but carefully maintained and nearly impossible to detect with modern scanning equipment. Jorge understood immediately. The analog backup. They'll be looking for digital defenses, modern countermeasures. Not Cold War era, hardware running on independent circuits. His weathered face broke into a fierce grin. Just like Bogota. Maria allowed herself a small smile. Eduardo had always been brilliant, but he'd also been proud. He'd assumed she'd upgraded everything to current technology, forgetting the lessons of their old cat-and-mouse games. "Sarah, initiate Protocol Echo. Elena, get me a direct channel to Eduardo's vehicle. Thomas, tell your NSA contacts to look away for the next 15 minutes. And Jorge," she paused, looking at her old friend, "get the coffee ready. We're about to have a reunion." The farm's outer lights went dark as Sarah executed the command. In the sudden blackness, Maria's enhanced cameras caught the confusion spreading through the cartel teams. Their modern night vision equipment, designed to work with ambient light, struggled to penetrate the artificial darkness. But Eduardo's vehicle kept moving, following a path that Maria herself might have chosen 30 years ago. "Channel open," Elena reported. "He's accepting the connection." Maria picked up an old handset, the same one she'd used to coordinate operations during the Cold War. When she spoke, her voice carried decades of shared history. "Welcome home, Eduardo. I was wondering when you'd finally visit." The response came in Eduardo's familiar smooth tones, barely aged by the years. "Maria del Carmen. Still living in the shadows, I see, though perhaps not as quietly as you'd have everyone believe." There was amusement in his voice, and something else. Respect, maybe even a touch of fear. "You know me," Maria replied, watching his vehicle's heat signature through her thermal feeds. "I never could resist a good garden. The roses are particularly lovely this time of year. though your men seem to have trampled some of my favorites. Eduardo's laugh was just as she remembered it. Always the same, Maria, hiding steel behind courtesy. Tell me, did you choose this farm because of the sightlines, or because of the old smuggling tunnels beneath it? Both, she admitted. Though I've made some improvements over the years. Would you like to see them? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just about the farm, or even about the cartel's expansion. This was about finishing something that had started in 1973. A game of shadows and secrets that had spanned decades. Your nephew made a mistake, Maria continued, watching Eduardo's vehicle slow to a stop at exactly the point she'd predicted. He thought he was threatening a helpless old woman. But you know better, don't you? You always did understand the long game. Miguel Jr. is impulsive, Eduardo agreed. Like his father. He never understood the true potential of what we were building. But you did, didn't you, Maria? That's why you've spent 30 years preparing for this moment. Maria's fingers moved across her keyboard, activating systems that had lain dormant for decades. Around Eduardo's vehicle, hidden panels in the ground began to open, revealing technology that had been obsolete before Miguel Jr. was born. Sometimes, she knew, the best moves in chess were the ones from games long forgotten. Shall we finish what we started in Bogotá? She asked, though they both knew it wasn't really a question. The pieces were already in motion, the board set for a final game between two grandmasters of the Shadow War. The first sign that Eduardo had prepared for this confrontation came at exactly 3:17 a.m. Every digital system in Maria's command center suddenly flickered, screens filling with cascading error messages. Sarah's hands flew across her keyboards, her usual confidence giving way to genuine concern. Multiple breach attempts, she reported, voice tense. They're hitting us with something I've never seen before. Quantum-based attack protocols, but with... Wait, this isn't right. She looked up at Maria, eyes wide. They're using hybrid algorithms, modern quantum computing combined with old Soviet cipher techniques. Maria felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the thrill of recognition. Eduardo always was a good student, she murmured, moving to her own station. He's using the encoding method we developed together in '82, but he's modified it. Her arthritic fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, entering commands into systems that hadn't been activated in decades. Deep beneath the orange groves, ancient computers hummed to life. The command center's modern screens went dark, replaced by monochrome displays running software that predated the internet. Sometimes, Maria explained to Sarah's bewildered look, the best defense is to step backwards. Eduardo's quantum attacks can't breach systems that run on punch cards and magnetic tape. Through the old monitors, they watched Eduardo's forces begin their real assault. It wasn't the brute force attack Miguel Jr. would have ordered. This was something far more sophisticated. Teams of operators moved through the orange grove in complex patterns, each group covering the other's blind spots. Their electronic warfare suite was broadcasting on frequencies designed to overwhelm modern defense systems. North perimeter sensors are dark, Thomas reported. South grid showing multiple failures. They're isolating sections of our defensive ring, creating blind spots. He paused, understanding dawning in his eyes. Creating blind spots exactly where our old backup systems are located. He remembers the Bogotá protocol. Maria nodded. Expecting us to fall back on secondary systems that he can track and counter. She allowed herself a small smile. But he's forgotten the first rule I taught him. Never play the game your opponent expects. Sarah was watching the ancient computers with growing appreciation. These systems, they're not just old, they're custom built. You've been preparing them for this specific scenario, haven't you? For 30 years, Maria confirmed. Every upgrade to the farm's defenses included a parallel system using technology Eduardo would remember. Breadcrumbs, leading him exactly where I wanted him to go. She turned to Jorge. Is your team in position? The old Special Forces operator nodded. His tactical vest might have been modern, but the weapon in his hands was pure Cold War, a modified AK-47 that would work perfectly, even if Eduardo's forces managed to disable more sophisticated firearms. Ready on your mark. Maria's fingers danced across the keyboard one more time, activating the farm's final defensive protocols. Throughout the orange grove, hidden panels slid open in the irrigation pipes. Ancient speakers, carefully maintained, for decades, crackled to life. The sound that emerged was barely audible, a subsonic hum that would play havoc with modern electronic equipment while leaving older systems untouched. Eduardo's voice crackled through their emergency channel. Clever, old friend, using the sonic disruption technique we developed in Munich. But tell me, did you also remember what we learned in Prague? As if on cue, new signatures appeared on their thermal scans. Teams of operators emerging from hiding spots in the grove, positions they'd taken hours before the first cartel members had appeared. They moved with the precision of elite special forces, but their tactics, Maria recognized them immediately. Those are our old CIA infiltration patterns, Eleanor observed. But with subtle modifications, they've adapted them for modern technology. Eduardo's been busy, Maria agreed, building his own shadow agency, training operators in our old methods. She watched the thermal signatures converge on the farm's defensive positions. But he's forgotten something important about those tactics. The farm's outer defensive ring erupted in a series of precisely timed explosions. Not the simple claymore, mines or modern smart munitions Eduardo's teams would have been expecting. These were old-school devices, mechanical triggers connected to surplus Soviet equipment. The kind of weapons that had been obsolete for decades, which made them perfect for this moment. In the confusion that followed, Jorge's team made their move. They emerged from hidden bunkers throughout the grove, their outdated weapons and simple night vision equipment suddenly advantages rather than liabilities. Eduardo's sophisticated forces found their high-tech gear malfunctioning, caught between Maria's subsonic disruptors and the electromagnetic pulses from the detonations. Second wave incoming, Sarah reported, watching through cameras that ran on closed circuits instead of modern networks, multiple vehicles, heavily armed. They're using... Wait, that's impossible. She stared at her readings in disbelief. They're using exact copies of our own surveillance equipment. Everything we installed over the past 5 years. Maria nodded, unsurprised. Eduardo's been watching us longer than we thought, learning, adapting, preparing for this moment just as we were. She turned to Eleanor. Get me a secure channel to the NSA team standing by at Fort Huachuca. It's time to show Eduardo why you don't bring modern weapons to an analog fight. The battle that unfolded over the next hour would never appear in any official record. Eduardo's forces, trained in modern combat and equipped with the latest technology, found themselves fighting ghosts. Maria's defenders seemed to appear and disappear at will, using routes and techniques that hadn't been employed since the Berlin Wall fell. Every time Eduardo's operators thought they'd found a pattern to exploit, the pattern would shift. Hidden speakers played recordings of firefights from other sectors of the grove, creating phantom battles that drew his forces into carefully prepared kill zones. Ancient landlines, laid decades ago and never connected to modern networks, carried commands that couldn't be intercepted or jammed. In the command bunker, Maria orchestrated it all with the precision of a symphony conductor. Her screens showed the familiar patterns of an operation she'd planned for 30 years. Watching Eduardo's forces slowly realize they were caught in a trap that had been decades in the making. Multiple teams retreating to secondary positions, Thomas reported. They're trying to establish a new perimeter using the irrigation ditches as cover. He paused, studying the thermal feeds. Eduardo's vehicle is moving. He's heading for the old reservoir access road, Maria finished. Just like I taught him in Mexico City. When conventional tactics fail, find the route your opponent thinks is impossibly dangerous. She turned to Jorge. Is the welcome party ready? Jorge's weathered face broke into a fierce grin. Waiting exactly where you said they'd be needed. Elena's profile was perfect. Eduardo couldn't resist using our own extraction protocols against us. Maria allowed herself a moment of pride in her team. Elena's psychological analysis, Jorge's tactical expertise, Sarah's integration of old and new technology, Thomas's strategic oversight. They had all played their parts perfectly. But the game wasn't over yet. Eduardo still had one card left. To play one last gambit that only Maria could see coming. Sarah, she commanded, initiate Protocol Omega. Elena, get ready to receive some very interesting visitors. Thomas, make sure our friends at the NSA are recording everything that's about to happen. She picked up her old service pistol, a 38 Special that had served her faithfully since Saigon. It's time to show Eduardo why you never try to outthink your teacher. The orange grove erupted in a new series of explosions, but these weren't the controlled detonations of earlier defensive measures. Eduardo's forces had brought their own surprises. Modern demolition charges designed to create precisely calculated chaos. Through the smoke and confusion, Maria watched thermal signatures moving with renewed purpose. They weren't retreating anymore. They were converging. Multiple breach attempts on the command bunker, Sarah reported, her voice tense but controlled. This is incredible. They're using a hybrid of our own security protocols combined with something completely new. Quantum encryption layered over old Soviet codes, but with a third layer I've never seen before. Maria smiled, feeling the familiar rush of a worthy opponent making their final move. Eduardo's masterpiece, she said softly, the perfect fusion of old and new, just like he always dreamed of creating. She turned to her team, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through decades of shadow wars. Ladies and gentlemen, the real game is about to begin. The command bunker's ancient ventilation system carried the first sounds of Eduardo's master stroke, a high-pitched whine that made Sarah's modern equipment spark and smoke. But Maria's older systems, hardened against electromagnetic warfare during the Cold War, continued functioning perfectly. Through backup cameras running on independent circuits, she watched Eduardo's endgame unfold. Multiple teams converging on all access points, Thomas reported, his voice steady despite the growing tension. They're using a triple-layer formation we developed in Nicaragua, but there's something else. He leaned closer to his screen, studying the thermal patterns. The outer layer isn't military or cartel. Those signatures match diplomatic security. Protocols. Eleanor's eyes widened as she cross-referenced the data. He's got State Department contractors in his force. Private security with top-level clearance. She turned to Maria, understanding dawning in her expression. This isn't just about the cartel anymore, is it? Eduardo's built exactly what we feared. In '73, a shadow organization embedded in legitimate government operations. Maria nodded, memories of old investigations flooding back. The cartel was always just a cover. Miguel Sr. never knew that his own brother was using the drug operation to finance something much bigger. By the time we shut them down in '73, Eduardo had already laid the groundwork for his real mission. Sarah's fingers flew across multiple keyboards, correlating data from decades of intelligence operations. The pattern, it's incredible. Shell companies, private security firms, technology startups, all linked to former intelligence operators. He's built a private intelligence agency hidden inside legitimate businesses. And now he's finally ready to show his hand, Maria finished. She turned to the main tactical display, watching Eduardo's forces execute a containment pattern that she herself had helped develop 40 years ago. Jorge, is the Lazarus Protocol ready? The old Special Forces operator smiled grimly. Everything's in position. Just like you planned it. Though I still think you're crazy for not telling us about this contingency until now. Need to know, Maria replied, the ghost of a smile crossing her face. And now you need to know. Eduardo isn't just trying to capture this farm. He's after something specific, something he thinks is hidden in the subsystems of our old communication network. The bunker fell silent as the implications sank in. Elena was the first to understand. The directory, she whispered. He thinks you have a copy of the directory. Maria nodded. The directory had been mythical even during the height of the Cold War. A comprehensive database of every covert operator, safe house, and hidden account from 40 years of shadow operations. Most thought it had been destroyed during the fall of the Soviet Union. Only a handful knew the truth. That's impossible, Thomas protested. The directory was stored on magnetic tape formats that are unreadable by modern computers. Even if it survived, the encryption would be exactly the kind of hybrid system Eduardo's been preparing to crack, Maria finished. Old Soviet codes combined with modern quantum computing. He spent 30 years building the perfect key to unlock a 40-year-old vault. Through their surviving cameras, they watched Eduardo's forces begin their final approach. The outer teams were creating precise gaps in their formation, gaps that exactly matched the farm's defensive capabilities. They were deliberately triggering certain security systems while avoiding others, herding Maria's defenders into predetermined positions. He's using our own containment protocols against us, Jorge observed. Every defensive measure we activate gives his algorithms more data about our capabilities. He's not just fighting us, He's mapping the entire security architecture of the farm. Maria allowed herself a moment of pride in her old protégé's brilliance. Eduardo had learned his lessons well, perhaps too well. He was executing a perfect synthesis of old and new tactics, using each layer of the farm's defenses to reveal the patterns hidden beneath. "Sarah," Maria commanded, "initiate the Lazarus Protocol. Full spectrum, all systems." She turned to her old friends, seeing the same mixture of anticipation and concern in their eyes. What Eduardo doesn't know is that this farm isn't just protected by 40 years of security measures. It's protected by 40 years of patience. Sarah's hands moved across her keyboards, entering commands into systems that spanned generations of technology. Throughout the orange grove, hidden mechanisms began to activate. But these weren't the obvious defensive measures Eduardo's forces had been cataloging. These were something else entirely. Multiple subterranean signatures, Thomas reported, watching his thermal displays with growing amazement. The irrigation tunnels, they're not just tunnels. The entire underground network is one giant analog computer, Maria finished. Every pipe, every conduit, every seemingly random maintenance tunnel, they're all part of a mechanical processing system that's been running calculations for 30 years. While Eduardo was building his digital hybrid system, we were building something he'd never expect. A computer that doesn't use a single electronic component. Through their cameras, they watched understanding dawn on Eduardo's face as his careful assault pattern began to fall apart. His hybrid attack algorithms, designed to bridge the gap between old and new technology, found themselves trying to crack a system that operated on principles more akin to a mechanical watch than a modern computer. "Signal incoming," Elena announced. Eduardo's requesting direct communication. Maria picked up her old handset, feeling the familiar weight of it. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out," she said when the connection clicked open. Eduardo's laugh was appreciative, despite the tension. A mechanical computer hidden in an irrigation system, processing power measured in water pressure and fluid dynamics instead of quantum states. "I should have known you'd think of something so elegantly ancient." "You taught me well," Maria replied. "Or did you forget our conversations in that cafe in East Berlin? About how the most unbreakable systems are the ones that don't try to outsmart technology, they ignore it completely." "The directory," Eduardo said, all pretense gone from his voice. "Where is it really, Maria? All these years, all this preparation, you must have known I'd come for it eventually." Maria's smile was evident in her voice. "Oh, Eduardo, you still haven't figured it out, have you? The directory was never here. It was never anywhere. The real directory is something much more valuable than a database of old operations." She nodded to Sarah, who initiated the final sequence of the Lazarus Protocol. Throughout the grove, Eduardo's forces found their carefully planned containment patterns suddenly irrelevant. The mechanical computer wasn't defending against their attack. It was revealing something else entirely. "My God," Elena breathed, watching the patterns emerge on their tactical displays. The entire farm, every tree, every structure, every seemingly random element of its design, it's all a code, a physical manifestation of 40 years of intelligence operations, Maria confirmed. "The real directory isn't hidden in some computer system, Eduardo. It's hidden in plain sight. Every pattern of irrigation pipes, every arrangement of trees, every maintenance schedule, they're all part of a living database that can only be read by people who know exactly what they're looking for." Through their cameras, they watched Eduardo step out of his vehicle, his face showing a mixture of frustration and admiration as he finally understood the true scope of Maria's decades-long operation. "You turned the entire farm into a dead drop," he said over the radio. "The ultimate analog storage system. No database to hack, no codes to break, just patterns and relationships that only make sense to those who were there. And now you have a choice," Maria replied, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "You can continue this assault, try to capture the farm by force, maybe even succeed. But the knowledge you're looking for can't be taken. It can only be shared by people who understand that some secrets are best kept in the minds and memories of those who lived them." The orange grove fell silent as Eduardo considered her words. His forces held their positions, waiting for orders, while Maria's defenders watched through layers of old and new security systems. The confrontation had shifted from a physical battle to something more profound, a contest of philosophies about how the shadow world should operate. "Your move, old friend," Maria said, softly into the radio. But choose carefully. Some games can only be won by deciding not to play. Eduardo's laugh crackled through the old radio, a sound Maria hadn't heard since Bogota. You always were 3 steps ahead, weren't you? He stepped away from his vehicle, hands raised. Stand down, he commanded his teams. The old woman's beaten us again. Through her monitors, Maria watched Eduardo's forces lower their weapons. In the command bunker, Sarah verified the signal shutdown sequences, while Elena tracked thermal signatures retreating to safe distances. Only Eduardo himself walked forward, following a path through the orange trees that Maria had planted 30 years ago specifically for this moment. The directory was never the real target, was it? Eduardo's voice was closer now, coming through both the radio and the grove's hidden speakers. You knew I'd figure out the farm's secret eventually. This whole operation, you wanted me to come. Maria smiled, checking her screens one last time before rising from her station. Some games are about more than winning, Eduardo. You taught me that in Prague. She turned to her team. Jorge, Elena, Thomas, would you escort our guest to the kitchen? I believe it's time we all had some coffee. The reunion in Maria's kitchen was decades in the making. Eduardo, still sharp in his tailored suit, sat across from his old mentor while Sarah secured the property's perimeter and Jorge's team supervised the withdrawal of Eduardo's forces. The coffee was the same blend Maria had served in safe houses across 4 continents. Miguel Jr. doesn't know, does he? Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. About the real organization you've built, about what his father's cartel was actually funding all those years ago. Eduardo shook his head. He thinks he's expanding a drug empire. Just like his father, he never understood the bigger picture. He sipped his coffee, appreciating the familiar taste. But you did. You always saw what we were really building. A shadow network, Maria nodded. Not for running drugs or guns, but for maintaining balance. A way to keep the old rules alive in a world that's forgotten why we created them in the first place. Through the kitchen window, the morning sun painted the orange grove gold. Somewhere out there, encoded in the patterns of trees and irrigation pipes, lay the true directory, not just a database of operations, but a living record of the unwritten rules that had governed the shadow world for generations. So, Eduardo set down his cup. What happens now, old friend? Maria smiled, the same smile that had unsettled foreign agents and cartel lords for 40 years. Now we do what we should have done in '73. We work together to protect what's really important, not the secrets themselves, but the wisdom of knowing how to keep them. As the sun rose over Mesa Valley, 2 old spies sat in a kitchen that had seen more history than most government offices, sharing coffee and memories, and planning for a future that would never appear in any official record. Sometimes, Maria knew, the greatest victories were the ones that looked exactly like surrender. The Orange Grove kept its secrets, waiting for the next generation of quiet guardians who would learn to read the patterns hidden in its peaceful rows. And somewhere in Mexico, Miguel Ortiz Jr. was about to learn that some empires are best left in the shadows where they belong. 3 days after Eduardo's surrender, Maria's Orange Grove hummed with renewed activity. On the surface, it looked like a cleanup operation. Contractors repairing damaged fences, landscapers replanting trampled roses. But beneath this mundane facade, a more significant transformation was taking place. The NSA team is gone, Sarah reported, her workstation now relocated to Maria's kitchen table. Last satellite pass confirmed they've withdrawn to Fort Huachuca. No active surveillance on the property. She paused, double-checking her readings. Well, no official surveillance. We've got at least 3 unofficial observers in the hills. CIA, probably FBI, and something else. Eleanor smiled, not looking up from her psychological profiles. The something else would be Eduardo's people. He's making sure we hold up our end of the arrangement. She passed a tablet to Maria, displaying a complex network of connections. His organization is actually quite elegant. Private security, firms, technology contractors, logistics companies, all staffed by former intelligence operators who understand the old ways. More than that, Thomas added, spreading paper files across the kitchen counter. Look at the pattern of his operations over the past 20 years. Every major conflict, every potential flashpoint, his teams were there, not to participate, but to maintain boundaries. They're peacekeepers who don't officially exist. Maria nodded, watching Eduardo himself through the kitchen window. He stood in the orange grove with Jorge, discussing the layout of trees as if they were comparing agricultural techniques. But Maria knew they were really reviewing the physical encoding system that made the farm's living database possible. Miguel Jr. has gone quiet, Elena continued, pulling up surveillance feeds from Mexico. After Eduardo's call, he withdrew his forces from 3 states. The official story is that he's consolidating territory, but chatter suggests he's trying to understand what really happened here. He won't, Maria said softly. Just like his father, he'll never see the bigger picture. The cartel was always meant to be exactly what it appears, a criminal organization pursuing profit and power. The perfect cover for Eduardo's real work. Sarah looked up from her computers, curiosity evident in her expression. But why maintain the cartel at all? If Eduardo's built this shadow peacekeeping force, why not abandon the criminal enterprise entirely? Balance, Eduardo answered, entering the kitchen with Jorge. The world needs its demons, its clear villains. As long as organizations like the cartel exist, governments maintain their intelligence services, their covert operations teams. And, in that shadow world, we can operate, keeping the peace in ways official agencies cannot. Maria poured fresh coffee for everyone, the familiar ritual masking the historic significance of this moment. The cartel provides more than cover, she explained. It provides infrastructure, connections, and most importantly, deniability. When we need to move people or resources to prevent a conflict, having a criminal network as camouflage is invaluable. Which is why you let me think I was really after the directory. Eduardo smiled, accepting his cup. You needed to draw me out, to force this confrontation, to show me that there was a better way to achieve what we both wanted. The kitchen fell silent as the full scope of Maria's strategy became clear. Elena was the first to understand, her analyst's mind assembling the pieces. The farm, the directory, even the defensive systems, they were never meant to keep Eduardo out. They were designed to draw him in, to convince him to join forces instead of working in parallel. For 30 years, Maria confirmed. I've watched Eduardo build his shadow organization, using the cartel as cover, just as we used official agencies during the Cold War. But the world is changing. The old methods of maintaining balance are failing. We needed to adapt, to combine our resources and knowledge. And Miguel Jr.'s ambitions provided the perfect opportunity, Thomas realized. His reckless expansion plans forced Eduardo to accelerate his timetable, to risk exposing his real operation. You used that pressure to force this meeting. Maria walked to her window, surveying her domain. The Orange Grove was more than a cover story or a clever data storage system. It was a symbol of how the shadow world should operate. Patient, organic, growing, according to careful plans while appearing completely natural. Sarah, she called. Show them the new security protocols. The young woman's fingers flew across her keyboard, bringing up displays that showed the integration of Eduardo's modern systems with Maria's analog defenses. It's beautiful, she admitted. The quantum encryption layered over mechanical computing, digital networks strengthened by old-school tradecraft. We're creating something completely new. More than new, Eduardo added, studying the displays. We're creating a blueprint for the future, a way to maintain the balance without relying solely on governments or criminal enterprises. A true shadow organization dedicated to keeping the peace in a world that's becoming more chaotic every day. Jorge, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. The next generation will need training, not just in technology and tactics, but in understanding why we operate the way we do, the wisdom behind the methods. Maria smiled, watching the interplay of sunlight and shadow through her orange trees. That's why we're all here. Each of us brings something essential. Eduardo's modern network, my old world tradecraft, Sarah's technical brilliance, Elena's psychological insight, Thomas's strategic vision, Jorge's tactical experience. Together, we'll build something that can survive in both the old world and the new. Through the kitchen window, they could see new contractors arriving. Not the cleanup crews visible to casual observers, but specialists carefully chosen from Eduardo's organization and Maria's network. They would begin the process of integrating the two systems, creating something unprecedented in the shadow world. Miguel Jr. will need watching, Eduardo noted. He may not understand what we're doing, but he'll sense that something has changed, that his uncle is no longer solely focused on the cartel's interests. Let him wonder, Maria replied. Sometimes the most effective secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight. An old woman's orange grove, a cartel's expansion plans, a series of seemingly unconnected security companies. Who would ever suspect they're all part of maintaining global stability? As the sun set over Mesa Valley, Maria's kitchen continued to buzz with activity. Plans were made, protocols established, futures shaped. The world would never know how close it had come to chaos, or how an elderly farmer and her unlikely alliance had helped maintain the balance between light and shadow. Sarah's computers continued to hum, integrating old systems with new. Elena's psychological profiles grew more comprehensive as she mapped the human element of their combined operations. Thomas coordinated with his extensive network of contacts, carefully managing the official narrative of what had occurred at the farm. And through it all, Maria and Eduardo sat at her kitchen table, drinking coffee and planning for a future that would never appear in any official history. 1 year later, the orange grove bloomed in the early morning light, trees heavy with fruit that would never reach any market. Maria sat in her rocking chair, watching a new generation of operators training among the carefully arranged rows. To anyone passing by, they looked like agricultural students learning irrigation techniques. Only Maria could see how they were really studying the physical encoding system that made her farm the world's most sophisticated analog database. Latest report from Beijing, Sarah announced, emerging from the house with 2 cups of coffee. At 28, she'd become Maria's unofficial successor, bridging the gap between old tradecraft and new technology. Eduardo's team prevented a potential crisis in the South China Sea. No one outside this farm will ever know how close we came to open conflict. Maria accepted her coffee with a knowing smile. In the year since their confrontation, Eduardo's organization had merged seamlessly with her network. The cartel, under Miguel Jr.'s oblivious leadership, continued to provide perfect cover for their real operations. Every apparent drug shipment or territory dispute carefully orchestrated to mask the movement of peacekeepers and resources. Elena's psychological division is proving invaluable, Sarah continued, settling into a second rocking chair that had become hers. Her profiles helped us identify 3 potential flashpoints before they could escalate. The CIA is still trying to figure out why certain regional conflicts simply evaporated. Through her security feeds, Maria watched Jorge leading a training session in the underground bunker. His students were an eclectic mix: former intelligence operators, reformed, cartel members, and carefully selected recruits from agencies around the world. They learned not just tactics and technology, but the philosophy that had guided Maria's work for half a century. Thomas has completed the integration protocols, Sarah reported. We now have seamless coordination between Eduardo's modern network and our analog systems. Even quantum computers can't crack it, because half the data exists only in the physical patterns of the grove. Maria nodded, remembering how Eduardo had laughed when he finally understood the full scope of her design. The farm wasn't just a database or a training facility, it was a blueprint for a new kind of intelligence organization, one that could operate in both the digital and analog worlds, maintaining balance through wisdom rather than force. And Miguel Jr.? Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. Still consolidating his empire, Sarah smiled. Every move carefully guided by Eduardo's people. He thinks he's building the most sophisticated cartel in history. He'll never realize he's actually helping maintain global stability. A discreet alert sounded from Sarah's tablet. Incoming transmission from Eduardo, Priority 1. Maria sat down her coffee, watching the sunrise paint her orange trees gold. The next crisis? No. Sarah's voice held a note of pride. The next generation. Eduardo's identified 3 more farms, strategically located across different continents. He wants to begin replicating your encoding system, creating a network of living databases, each one appearing to be nothing more than an agricultural operation. Maria smiled, remembering a conversation in a Bogotá safe house nearly 50 years ago. Eduardo had been young then, already dreaming of building something that could outlast governments and agencies. Now, together, they were creating exactly that, a shadow network dedicated not to power or profit, but to maintaining the delicate balance that kept the world turning. Through her cameras, Maria watched her orange grove come alive with morning activity. Agents disguised as farmhands, analysts posing as agricultural researchers, trainers teaching ancient tradecraft alongside cutting-edge technology. Every tree, every irrigation pipe, every seemingly random element of the farm's design contributing to a system that would outlive them all. You know, Sarah said softly, most people will never know what really happens here. They'll never understand how many conflicts were prevented, how many lives were saved, because an old woman decided to plant her orange trees in very specific patterns. That's exactly the way it should be, Maria replied, her weathered hands steady as she lifted her coffee cup. The best victories are the ones that look like nothing happened at all. In the distance, a new group of recruits arrived, escorted by Elena's team. They would learn the old ways and the new, discovering how to read the messages hidden in the patterns of trees, understanding why some secrets were best kept in plain sight. The shadow war would continue, but now it would be fought with wisdom, as well as technology, guided by the lessons encoded in an old woman's orange grove. As the sun climbed higher, Maria watched her legacy flourish. The farm would continue its work long after she was gone, its secrets passed down through generations of quiet guardians. In the end, she had created something more powerful than any weapon or database. She had created a way to maintain peace through understanding rather than force. The orange trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, their branches heavy with fruit and secrets, while beneath them, the next generation learned to read the patterns that would help them keep the world in balance. And in her rocking chair, Maria smiled, knowing that her life's work would continue growing, one carefully planted tree at a time.